The day Elijah Whitmore agreed to marry a black woman, the wind over Red River County carried more than dust. It carried whispers, sharp and dangerous, cutting through saloons, churches, and cattle pens alike. Elijah Whitmore was not just a cattle baron. He was the cattle baron, owner of more land than some men could ride across in a lifetime, a man whose boots had never known mud that wasn't conquered and whose name alone could silence a room. When word spread that he had agreed, not chosen, not begged to marry a black woman named Sarah Mae Johnson, disbelief hardened into outrage. Men spat on the ground when they said her name. Women clutched their shawls tighter and pretended not to stare. And Sarah herself stood at the center of it all, calm on the outside, heart pounding like hooves on hard earth, knowing this agreement was never meant to be love, only leverage. Elijah had proposed with terms, not tenderness. Her father's land, a narrow strip bordering Whitmore Ranch, had become suddenly valuable once the railway announced expansion. The Whitmore lawyers had descended like vultures, but her father had refused to sell, stubborn pride flaring brighter than caution. Then illness came, swift and cruel, and debt followed close behind. Elijah's offer arrived folded in thick paper and colder words. Marriage would settle the debt, secure the land, and make the problem disappear quietly. To Elijah, it was business. To Sarah, it was survival, but not surrender. She remembered standing across from him in his office, the smell of leather and cigar smoke heavy in the air, his gray eyes assessing her as if she were another piece of property to be branded. He had expected fear, perhaps gratitude. What he got instead unsettled him. Sarah met his gaze without flinching. She was not young in spirit, though her years were few, shaped by a lifetime of watching doors close softly but firmly in her face. She knew what this marriage would look like to the world, a powerful white rancher, magnanimously taking responsibility, and a black woman presumed lucky to be chosen. She also knew what it would look like to herself, a battlefield disguised as a home. The agreement was signed without ceremony. Elijah shook her hand like a man closing a deal, not a groom pledging a future. Yet as Sarah left his office, she felt something shift, not weakness but resolve. If she was to step into his world, she would not do so quietly. The engagement announcement detonated across the county. At church the following Sunday, the pews creaked under the weight of tension. The preacher stammered through his sermon, eyes flicking nervously toward Sarah as if she were a test of faith no one had studied for. Elijah sat stiffly at the front, jaw tight, pretending indifference while feeling the heat of judgment on his back. He told himself he didn't care. He had weathered droughts, stampedes, and men with guns drawn. This would pass. But when he glanced sideways and saw Sarah beside him, back straight, hands folded, eyes forward, something uncomfortable stirred. She was not shrinking. She was enduring. That night, alone in her small room at her father's house, Sarah pressed her palms together and breathed deeply, aware that fear would be easy, expected even, but fear was a luxury she could not afford. She thought of her mother, who had scrubbed floors until her hands cracked, who had taught her that dignity was something no one could take unless you handed it over willingly. Sarah whispered a promise into the dark. "I will not disappear." Preparations moved quickly. Elijah insisted on a simple ceremony, less attention, fewer questions. But attention came anyway. In town, rumors grew claws. Some said Sarah had trapped him. Others claimed he was making a statement, or worse, committing social suicide. No one asked Sarah what she wanted. That omission fueled her. Days before the wedding, Elijah's sister Clara arrived from the city, eyes sharp and mouth tighter still. She studied Sarah like a puzzle she resented having to solve. "You understand what this means," Clara said coolly over tea that went untouched. The scrutiny, the hostility. Sarah nodded. "I've understood that my whole life," she replied softly. Clara had no answer for that. Elijah overheard fragments of such conversations and felt irritation coil in his chest, not at Sarah, but at the way others spoke about her as if she were invisible. The night before the wedding, he stood alone on the porch of his vast house, staring out at the land he had built his empire on. He told himself again that this was necessary, practical, controlled, yet he couldn't ignore the unease creeping in. Sarah was not behaving like someone grateful for rescue. She moved like someone preparing for something larger. The wedding day arrived under a pale sky. The church filled despite Elijah's wishes, curiosity proving stronger than courtesy. When Sarah entered, a hush fell, not because she was out of place, but because she was undeniable. Her dress was simple yet elegant, lace tracing strength rather than fragility. Her eyes shimmered, not with fear but with emotion held carefully in check. Elijah watched her walk toward him and realized for the first time that he did not fully understand the woman he was about to marry. As vows were spoken, Sarah's voice did not tremble. When Elijah repeated his, he felt the weight of them settle heavier than expected. The congregation waited for something, approval, condemnation, spectacle, but Sarah gave them none of it. She simply stood, present and unbowed. As they turned to leave the church, whispers erupted behind them like sparks. Elijah braced himself for a lifetime of managing scandal. Sarah, however, felt something else entirely: anticipation. Because while everyone believed this was the end of her struggle, she knew it was only the beginning. She had not married into silence. She had married into position. And what she planned to do next would change far more than Elijah Whitmore's expectations. If this chapter already has you leaning closer, wondering what Sarah will do in a world stacked against her. The morning after the wedding dawned clear and merciless, sunlight spilling across the Whitmore estate as if nothing extraordinary had occurred the day before, as if a line had not been crossed that could never be redrawn. Sarah woke before the house stirred, lying still in a bed too large, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a place that was now supposed to be her home. The walls were thick, the ceiling high. The air scented faintly of polished wood and restraint. Elijah slept beside her, turned slightly away, one arm flung across the sheets like a boundary marker. There had been no tenderness, no cruelty either, just distance agreed upon without words. Sarah rose quietly, dressed with care, and studied her reflection. She did not see a bride or a kept woman. She saw a witness. By the time the household staff gathered for breakfast, whispers had already begun, sliding between glances and half-finished sentences. Sarah felt them before she heard them, that familiar prickle along her spine. She took her seat at the long table without hesitation, hands folded, posture relaxed but deliberate. Elijah entered moments later, greeting no one in particular, and sat at the head as he always had. He expected the room to settle into routine. Instead, it held its breath. Sarah spoke first. She thanked the cook by name for the meal. The simple acknowledgement rippled through the room like a stone dropped in water. No one had expected that. Elijah glanced at her sharply, not angry, just surprised. Breakfast passed stiffly, but something had shifted. Afterward, as Elijah prepared to leave for the fields, Sarah followed him outside. "I'd like to see the ranch," she said. He frowned. "It's not a place for—" He stopped himself, jaw tightening. "It's rough." Sarah met his gaze evenly. "So is life," she replied. He hesitated, then nodded curtly. Hours later, dust clung to her skirts as she walked the land with him, listening more than she spoke, observing the rhythm of the operation, the men, the unspoken hierarchies. She asked questions that were precise, informed, and quietly unsettling. Elijah realized she understood contracts, supply chains, the fragile balance between profit and risk. That night, alone again in their shared room, he replayed the day in his mind, disturbed by how easily she had stepped into a world he had assumed would overwhelm her. Over the following weeks, Sarah did not hide in drawing rooms or linger behind closed doors. She learned names. She learned stories. She noticed injustices that had been normalized through repetition. Workers paid late. Families housed in conditions Elijah had never bothered to see up close. She did not accuse. She observed. And then one evening she asked Elijah for a ledger. He laughed, thinking it a joke. She did not smile. When he realized she was serious, irritation flared. "Why?" he demanded. Sarah folded her hands. "Because this ranch runs on people," she said. "And people don't stay loyal. When they're treated like replaceable parts." He stared at her, speech momentarily failing him. No one spoke to him like that. No one survived doing so. Yet here she stood, calm, unafraid, and undeniably right. He handed her the ledger, telling himself it was temporary, that he was indulging her curiosity. Days later, she returned it with notes tucked neatly inside. Observations, suggestions, questions he could not easily dismiss. Some would cost him money in the short term. Others promised stability he had never considered. He read them in silence, anger giving way to something more dangerous: respect. The county watched closely. They expected scandal, humiliation, proof that the marriage was a mistake. What they saw instead confused them. Sarah attended events at Elijah's side, dressed with quiet elegance, speaking when spoken to, but never apologizing for her presence. When insults came cloaked as courtesy, she answered with intelligence sharp enough to draw blood without raising her voice. Clara returned again, intending to assert control, only to find it slipping through her fingers. "You're changing him," she accused one afternoon. Sarah shook her head gently. "No," she said. "I'm showing him what he's been avoiding." The turning point came sooner than anyone expected. A dispute erupted on the ranch, workers threatening to leave after a foreman's abuse went unchecked. Elijah prepared to respond with force as he always had. Sarah stopped him. She asked to speak to the men. Laughter erupted at the suggestion. Elijah almost refused, but something in her expression made him pause. She stood before the workers, heart pounding but voice steady, and spoke of fairness, of shared interest, of dignity. She did not beg. She negotiated. By nightfall, the dispute was resolved without bloodshed or loss. The men stayed. Word spread like wildfire. Elijah sat alone afterward, staring at the land that had always obeyed him, realizing that his new wife had just accomplished something he never could. Not through power, but through trust. He went to her room, searching for words he had never practiced. "You surprised me," he said finally. Sarah looked up, eyes searching his face. "I didn't come here to be invisible," she replied. Silence stretched between them, heavy with possibility. In that moment, Elijah understood something that left him unsettled and strangely humbled. This marriage was no longer a transaction he controlled. Sarah had not entered his world to be saved. She had entered it to transform it and him. And this was only the beginning. If you feel the tension rising and want to see how far Sarah's quiet power will go, don't forget to subscribe to the channel now, because in the next chapter, her boldest move yet will challenge not just Elijah's authority, but the entire county's idea of who holds power. By the time autumn crept into Red River County, the land itself seemed to sense that something irreversible was unfolding. At Whitmore Ranch, the grass browned, the mornings sharpened with cold, and the air carried a restless expectancy that mirrored the town's mood. People no longer whispered only about the marriage. They whispered about the changes. Supplies arrived on time now. Wages were paid promptly. Injuries were treated instead of ignored. None of this bore Sarah's name officially, yet everyone knew whose influence guided it. Elijah watched it all with a mix of pride, irritation, and unease. He had built his reputation on command and fear, on the certainty that order required dominance. Now he was being forced to confront a truth he had long dismissed. That authority rooted in respect lasted longer than authority. Enforced by force, the realization did not come gently. It came in the form of resistance. Local cattlemen, men who had once envied Elijah from afar but now felt morally superior, gathered at the county hall and spoke of tradition, of lines that shouldn't be crossed. They spoke of him with disappointment, thinly veiled as concern, and they spoke of Sarah with something far uglier. Elijah heard of it from a foreman who lingered at the door, uncomfortable, loyal but afraid. Rage flared hot and immediate. He saddled his horse, ready to confront them with the methods he knew best. Sarah stopped him at the threshold. She did not raise her voice. She did not plead. She simply asked, "What will that prove?" Elijah froze. He realized with a jolt that his anger was no longer just his own pride, it was fear. Fear that he was losing control, not of his ranch but of himself. Sarah proposed something that sounded at first like madness, a public gathering on Whitmore land, not to defend themselves but to open dialogue. Elijah laughed harshly. "They won't listen," he said. Sarah's gaze never wavered. "Then let them see," she replied. Preparations began quietly. Invitations were extended not just to landowners but to workers, families, townsfolk who had never set foot beyond the ranch gates. When the day arrived, wagons rolled in from every direction. The crowd was tense, expectant, suspicious. Elijah stood beside Sarah, feeling more exposed than he ever had in a gunfight. She spoke first. She told her story not with bitterness but with clarity. She spoke of her father's land, of loss, of the cost of silence. She spoke of dignity as a shared resource, one that grew when honored and vanished when denied. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some scoffed. Others leaned in. Then Elijah did something no one expected. He spoke, not as a baron but as a man admitting his limitations. He acknowledged that his power had been built without asking who paid the price. The admission hung in the air, heavy and transformative. When the gathering ended, not everyone was convinced. But something had cracked. In the weeks that followed, Elijah faced consequences. Contracts were threatened. Partnerships dissolved. He lost money. For the first time in his life, success was no longer guaranteed by force of will. Late one night, sitting alone in his study, he confronted the possibility that marrying Sarah might cost him everything he had worked for. She found him there, shoulders slumped. The weight of uncertainty etched into his face. "Do you regret it?" he asked quietly. Sarah considered the question carefully. "No," she said. "But regret isn't the measure of a life. Courage is." The words struck him harder than any insult ever could. Slowly, something within Elijah shifted. He began to stand beside her openly, no longer bracing for scandal, but accepting it as the price of integrity. And then came the moment that left him truly speechless. Sarah announced she intended to establish a school on Whitmore land. For workers. Children. Black and white alike. The backlash was immediate and fierce. Elijah opened his mouth to argue, to calculate the cost, to warn her of the danger. But when he looked at her, saw the quiet certainty in her eyes, he realized something profound. She was not asking for permission. She was inviting him to choose what kind of man he would be. The room felt suddenly small. Elijah, the man who had controlled thousands of acres, found himself unable to speak. He nodded instead. And in that silence, a new legacy began to form. If this chapter has made you question what real power looks like, stay with us, subscribe to the channel now, because the final chapter reveals the outcome of Sarah's boldest vision and the transformation no one believed possible. The announcement of the school spread through Red River County faster than any cattle drive ever had, carried on tongues sharpened by fear and disbelief. A school on Whitmore land for everyone was not just a challenge to tradition. It was an act of defiance. Ministers warned of chaos from their pulpits. Business partners wrote letters thick with threats disguised as advice. Even men who had stood by Elijah for decades urged him to stop his wife before the damage became irreversible. Elijah listened to them all in silence, a silence that surprised even him. He had spent his life speaking, commanding, deciding. Now he found himself listening to the land, to the people, and most of all to the woman who had entered his life under the guise of a contract and rewritten its meaning entirely. Construction began under constant scrutiny. Nails were pulled loose in the night. Windows were shattered before they could be glazed. Each act of sabotage tested Elijah's resolve, and each time he expected Sarah to waver, to ask him to make it stop. She never did. Instead, she showed up every morning, sleeves rolled, voice calm, thanking those who came to help and meeting hostility with unshakable composure. Children began to gather even before the building was finished, drawn by curiosity and by the way Sarah spoke to them as if their futures mattered. Elijah watched from a distance at first, unsettled by the depth of his own transformation. He realized he was no longer protecting his reputation. He was protecting an idea larger than himself. The day the school opened, the crowd was smaller than Sarah had hoped, but larger than anyone had expected. There were scowls and folded arms, but there were also tentative smiles, hands held tightly, eyes bright with possibility. Sarah stood at the front, heart racing, and spoke not of defiance but of promise, of education as a bridge, not a weapon. Elijah stood beside her, no longer a baron defending territory, but a partner sharing purpose. The true test came weeks later when a fire broke out late one night. Flames licked the sky, threatening to erase everything they had built. Elijah ran toward the blaze without hesitation, shouting for help. Men followed, men who once would have turned away. Together they saved the structure, coughing and bruised, united by something stronger than fear. As dawn broke, smoke curling into the pale sky, Elijah looked at Sarah and understood what had left him speechless all along. She had never tried to change him by force. She had simply lived her values so clearly that resisting them became impossible. Years passed. The school endured. Children grew, learned, and carried its influence far beyond county lines. The whispers faded, replaced by reluctant respect. Elijah's fortune stabilized, not through dominance but through loyalty and trust. One evening, sitting on the porch as the sun dipped low, Elijah turned to Sarah and spoke words he had never planned to say. I thought I was saving my empire, he admitted. But you were building something that would outlive it. Sarah smiled. Not triumphant, but peaceful. Their marriage, born of necessity, had become a partnership of purpose. And the county that once mocked them now measured itself by the change they inspired. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you see strength in a new light, don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories of courage, transformation, and the quiet acts that change history.